So we get to finally talk about another iPad that came out several years ago, and this specific iPad is the iPad 3rd generation. Now what's very interesting about this device was that it came out pretty much right after the iPad 2nd generation. It was the third iPad that Apple kind of made. I mean, we had the iPad mini lineup that came out kind of too, but here's the thing about the iPad 3rd generation. This thing I think was a good update to the iPad 2, but it wasn't as big of an update as the iPad 2nd generation was. That iPad was a completely different beast, and Apple did a tremendous job with that specific iPad as well. Now starting off with the outside of the specific iPad, it looks pretty much just like every other iPad that we've seen in this generation. It came out in 2012, so it's definitely, showing its age now 10 years later. You have quite a bit of bezel around that display, but that display in and of itself was 9.7 inches. It was an IPS panel, and it was 1536 by 2048. And here's the thing about this panel. No Touch ID on the front. You do have a front-facing camera, but the resolution of this panel was so high that even now in 2022, this panel still actually looks pretty relevant. And as I mentioned before, this is one of Apple's strong suits. They make very, very good panels. This thing didn't have like True Tone or Pro Motion or anything at that time, but it was still a very good looking panel. And I, for one, am still a fan of the panel of this device, but I'm not a fan of the amount of bezel around it. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. But I think overall, this was definitely a really good looking panel at that point. Now you have the standard 30-pin connector on the bottom, and you actually did have a headphone jack on this thing too, so it's still showing its age there, but totally okay. And on the back, you have the aluminum back on this thing as well. And without a doubt, this iPad, just like every other iPad Apple has made, feels so premium still. I haven't really ever felt a cheap iPad, and that's something I've talked about before. I don't think Apple's ever made a cheap iPad either. And when you're getting an iPad like this, let alone any other tablet, even now the tablets that are being made by a lot of manufacturers don't even feel as premium as this thing. So Apple did a great job in this design, and I still think it holds up extremely well in 2022. Now we have to talk about the camera setup on this thing. Now it had a single 5 megapixel camera on the back, and it had a VGA camera on the front. Now I don't even know how many megapixels that is. I think it's like 0.3 megapixels or something. But here's what I'll tell you about this camera. It's really not a good camera anymore. It's funny because the build quality makes you think that this iPad is still perfect, but it really isn't. The camera on the back is, you can only shoot 1080p videos on it, and it's really not that good of a performing camera anymore, and that's kind of the sad thing about it. The thing with this iPad is, no matter what you're going to do, it's going to be a very basic camera, unless you're doing like super basic things, or you're like giving it to like some random person or like a kid or someone who doesn't care about cameras, then I think this is okay. But if you're really trying to go ahead and utilize an iPad camera, this thing is not going to be that good. An iPhone 5 has a better camera than this thing, and that is a big thing to keep in mind. Just because this thing was bigger and better doesn't mean it was better in every single area, and the camera is definitely not one of those areas for sure. Now, I think the only good thing about this camera is if you're trying to do things, like FaceTime calls and different things like that, then I think you may have a pretty good experience with it. I think if your expectations are like kind of low, but other than that, if you're trying to, do crazy things with this thing or whatever, you're really not going to be getting that good of an experience. And I would hate for me to recommend an iPad to you if you're expecting this camera to be great, because it really isn't. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. Now in terms of the longevity of this thing, you're pretty much already outdated. This thing stopped getting support at iOS 9.3.5, so you're really not going to be getting that much longer support when it comes down to it. And as I mentioned before, that's a big thing to keep in mind. You don't want to get an iPad and already have it outdated, and that's kind of what's going on if you're picking up this iPad. Like I mentioned, I would hate for me to recommend an iPad to you if it's already going to be outdated, and that's what's basically happening. This thing has been outdated for many years now, pretty much it's been outdated longer than it has been at this point. It stopped at iOS 9. We're now on iOS 15, about to go on iOS 16. So let alone all those features and everything that you're missing out on, but those security updates that came out with every single version of that software, it's pretty much outdated as well in that standpoint. So I don't want to keep bashing on this iPad because I do think it was a good iPad for sure, but I would highly not recommend picking it up, and this is pretty much the main reason why I wouldn't recommend picking it up anymore. Now on top of that, I guess we have to go and hit on the performance. Now this thing had that Apple A5X chip inside of it with a dual-core CPU, and it did come with 1GB of RAM, and this was actually a pretty good upgrade coming from some of the predecessors. And here's the thing about this iPad, like I mentioned, I still think that the performance is very good for the age of this iPad. Now personally, I wouldn't want to use this iPad anymore. I don't think it's that great, I don't think it's even good for today's standards, and if Apple were to go ahead and release an iPad with this type of performance today, I would probably have a problem with it. It would be super slow. But because this iPad is how old as it is and because it's as cheap as it is nowadays, you have to keep in mind that, when you're buying an iPad like this, you're not spending $1,000 on it. So that's why, mentally it seems like a better deal than it is. Although I probably wouldn't recommend buying it, it's still a very interesting tablet because of how smooth and, fast this thing is. Now, a lot of the applications you can't even download anymore. It's fairly outdated when it comes down to that standpoint too. But I do think if you're buying an iPad like this iPad 3rd generation, overall you're going to be getting a pretty smooth experience, and it may be smoother than a lot of people may expect. Now, personally, if you're buying this iPad like I mentioned, you may not be getting that smooth of a, performance for your daily tasks. I'm only saying this because, if you're expecting to be like taking a bunch of notes on this thing and you're expecting this thing to be, just the fastest iPad or even like a really good performing iPad, that is not going to be the case. Like I mentioned, a lot of applications aren't even supported on this software anymore, so you can't even download like half the apps, and if you can't even download like the most recent version of those apps either. So that is a really big disadvantage with this iPad, let alone the performance. And you're also not getting things like Apple Pencil support that we have on the new iPads. You don't have promotion, you don't have a lot of different things like that. Although it's still kind of smooth for how old it as it is, and it's still kind of decent at doing, standard things you would want, it's just very outdated and it just doesn't really make too much sense. I mean, I would rather be using like an iPhone 13 or even like an iPhone 10, maybe even like an iPhone 7. I would rather be using that thing than this thing. At least that iPhone is still getting support. And even though this thing has a bigger display and everything, it just really doesn't make too much sense to use it at this point. So if I were you, I would probably not want to use the iPad 3rd generation as my, main device to use. I would highly recommend avoiding to, buy this thing for that, but it's still pretty impressive for what it brought at that time, and I'm still a fan of it like I mentioned before. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this thing had that 11,560 milliamp hour battery inside of it, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, it's still a very decent performing iPad. This iPad still has a pretty good battery life inside of it, which is so crazy. I mean, it's not a new iPad, it's fairly outdated as of this point, but for it to be, as old as it is, and for the battery size to be that massive, it's actually pretty impressive what Apple did at that time. Now, it's definitely degraded over time, it's approaching 10 years old, and any device that has a 10-year-old battery, it's not going to be as great as it used to be, but still it's pretty impressive what Apple was able to do at that time, and I think it's a pretty decent iPad. I probably wouldn't recommend buying it because of, how old it is, but still, you have to give Apple some props for putting a massive size battery at that point on this iPad. So in terms of that covers it up there. And overall, I'm ending this video just like how I started it. I really wouldn't recommend buying this iPad anymore. It just really doesn't make too much sense in my opinion. I think this iPad had a lot of capability when it first came out, but nowadays, I mean, it's a very outdated tablet. It just doesn't really make too much sense to buy it. Like I mentioned, you're better off buying something like the iPad 4 or iPad 5. I would definitely not even recommend buying those. I'd recommend buying the iPad 6, 7, or 8. I'd recommend buying any of the iPad minis past the iPad mini 5, the iPad Air 3, but I do think if you're in the ballpark of buying this iPad, you are much better off buying the iPad 6th generation. That is also kind of it's not outdated, but it's an older iPad, but it's still going to be getting software support. And that is the biggest thing to keep in mind. You do not want to be in a situation where the iPad that you're buying is already outdated with software. And that's kind of what's happening if you're getting this iPad. So in terms of that, that's probably what I recommend you to do. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.